All right, so let's dive into some pretty intense stuff happening on the world stage.
Yeah.
We're talking about the International Criminal Court, ICC,
right,
and a proposed bill from the 119th Congress that's causing serious debate.
Yeah.
H.R. 23, the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act.
Okay.
So you want to understand what this bill is all about and why it matters.
Yeah.
We're here to break it down for you.
Right.
So,
the ICC, for those who need a quick refresher, was set up in 2002 through the Rome Statute.
Right.
It's essentially a court of last resort for trying individuals accused of the most severe international crimes, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity.
Wow.
You name it.
Okay.
Think of it as a global mechanism for justice.
Okay.
When national courts are unable or unwilling to act.
Right. And it's important to note that the U.S. and Israel are not parties to the Rome Statute.
All right.
Meaning they don't recognize the ICC's jurisdiction over them.
Yeah.
And that's where things get really interesting because the ICC has opened an investigation into alleged crimes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay.
They even issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
Really?
And that's what sparked this firestorm.
I see.
The U.S. in response is now considering this bill, H.R. 23.
Yeah.
Which basically aims to hamstring the ICC's ability to investigate or prosecute individuals considered protected persons under the Act. Think U.S. personnel, allies, and their officials.
Okay.
So let's break down exactly how this bill proposes to do that.
Right.
First, sanctions.
Okay.
We're talking about hitting individuals involved in ICC investigations with asset freezes, travel bans, the works.
Wow.
Second, funding cuts.
Okay.
The bill wants to pull the plug on any existing funds going to the ICC and bar any future appropriations. I see. And to keep things on a tight leash, the bill also mandates that the president regularly report to Congress on how these sanctions are being implemented.
Got it.
Basically, Congress wants to keep a close eye on how the administration is pushing back against the ICC. Okay, so we've got the mechanics of the bill.
Yeah.
But why is the U.S. pushing back so hard?
Right.
The bill itself argues that the ICC's actions are illegitimate, encroaching on U.S. sovereignty and potentially putting U.S. personnel and allies at risk of politically motivated prosecutions.
I see.
To understand this argument, we need to dig a little deeper into the concept of jurisdiction.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Each country has its own legal boundaries, right?
Right.
The ICC, however, is trying to apply international law to situations where national laws may not be sufficient. The U.S. is essentially saying, hold on, the ICC is overstepping its boundaries. You can't just come in and impose your legal framework on us or our allies.
Right.
But the bill's critics are pushing back hard on this idea, saying it sets a dangerous precedent. They argue that shielding individuals, especially those accused of grave crimes, from accountability undermines international justice.
I see.
Their concern is that if powerful nations like the U.S. simply ignore international courts when it's convenient, the entire system of global accountability weakens. It's a slippery slope argument. If one country can do it, why can't others? Where does it end?
Exactly.
This gets to a really fundamental question.
What is the role of an international court when dealing with nations that haven't agreed to be bound by its rules? Can a court like the ICC truly be effective if powerful countries can simply choose to ignore it? These are not easy questions, and they go to the heart of the debate surrounding H.R. 23.
And it's not just about the U.S.
No.
This bill could have a ripple effect across the international community. Think about it. If the U.S. openly defies the ICC, could that embolden other countries to do the same? Could we see a domino effect?
Wow.
Where international law becomes more of a suggestion than a binding set of rules?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's a legitimate concern.
Yeah.
And it raises another layer of complexity. U.S. relations with its allies. Many U.S. allies, particularly in Europe, are staunch supporters of the ICC. This bill could create serious friction and strain those relationships, potentially undermining cooperation on other critical global issues. It's fascinating to see how one bill can expose these fundamental tensions in international relations.
Absolutely.
We're talking about the pursuit of justice versus national sovereignty, the desire for global cooperation clashing with the protection of national interests. So you've brought up some really crucial points.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a bit and try to understand the potential consequences of this bill.
Absolutely. That's a question that's been debated for decades. You see, the U.S. has a long and complicated history with international institutions. On the one hand, the U.S. played a key role in establishing many of these institutions after World War II, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. But on the other hand, the U.S. has also shown a willingness to act unilaterally when it perceives its national interests to be at stake.
So there's this tension between supporting a rules-based international order and asserting U.S. exceptionalism when it suits them.
Precisely. And this bill, H.R. 23, is a prime example of that tension playing out in real time. It's essentially saying that the U.S. will cooperate with international institutions when it's convenient, but will push back when it feels those institutions are overstepping their bounds or infringing on U.S. sovereignty.
It seems like this bill could have a significant impact on U.S. foreign policy more broadly.
Absolutely. If this bill passes and the U.S. imposes sanctions on IC officials, it could damage relationships with key allies who support the court. Think about the European Union, for example. Many EU countries are strong proponents of international justice and view the ICC as a vital mechanism for holding individuals accountable for grave crimes.
So this bill isn't just about the ICC. It's about how the U.S. engages with the rest of the world and whether it sees itself as bound by international norms or is operating above them.
You hit the nail on the head, and that has implications for everything from trade agreements to military alliances to global efforts to address climate change. If the U.S. is seen as an unreliable partner, it could undermine its ability to lead on the world stage.
So what are the potential consequences if this act actually becomes law? I mean, beyond the diplomatic fallout with allies, what could this mean for the future of international justice?
That's the real question, isn't it? If the ICC's authority is weakened, it could have a ripple effect throughout the entire system of international law. Other countries might be emboldened to follow the U.S. lead challenging international courts or withdrawing from treaties they find inconvenient. It could lead to a more fragmented and less cooperative world where power and self-interest take precedence over justice and accountability.
That's a pretty bleak outlook.
Yeah.
Are there any arguments in favor of the U.S. taking a more assertive stance against the ICC?
Well, some argue that the ICC has become too bureaucratic and inefficient. They say that its prosecutions are often politically motivated and that it focuses too much on Africa while ignoring abuses committed by powerful countries. They believe that the U.S. can better promote accountability and justice through its own foreign policy initiatives rather than relying on an international body that they see as flawed.
So it's a question of trust and effectiveness.
Yeah.
Some believe that the U.S. can do a better job on its own, while others see the ICC as a crucial, albeit imperfect, mechanism for global justice.
Exactly. It's a classic debate about the balance of power between national interests and international cooperation. And there are valid arguments on both sides.
What would you say to someone who argues that the ICC is biased against certain countries or regions?
That's a criticism that's been leveled at the ICC, particularly from African nations. And it's important to acknowledge that the ICC has primarily focused on cases in Africa, but it's worth noting that most of those cases have been referred to the ICC by African governments themselves, and the ICC has also opened investigations in other parts of the world, including Georgia, Afghanistan, and Palestine.
So while there may be legitimate concerns about the ICC's track record, it's important to look at the full picture and avoid making generalizations.
Exactly. It's important to engage in these debates with nuance and avoid simplistic narratives.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential downsides of this bill and some of the arguments in favor of it. But I think it's important to come back to the core issue here, the concept of accountability for grave crimes. If the U.S. is successful in undermining the ICC, what happens to victims who are seeking justice for atrocities committed against them? What message does that send to perpetrators of these crimes?
That's a crucial question, and it's one that lawmakers need to grapple with as they consider this bill. If the ICC is weakened or rendered ineffective, it could create a climate of impunity where perpetrators of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity feel emboldened to act without fear of consequences. That would be a devastating setback for international justice and for the victims of these heinous crimes.
It's hard to imagine the long-term implications of that.
It's a chilling thought. And it underscores the importance of having a strong and effective international justice system that can hold individuals accountable regardless of their nationality or position of power.
I think it's important to step back for a moment and acknowledge the complexity of this situation. We're dealing with competing values, legal arguments, and geopolitical considerations.
Right.
It's not a simple black and white issue.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to engage with different perspectives, to understand the nuances of the arguments. Because ultimately, this is about something much bigger than just one bill or one international court. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. A world where power trumps justice, or a world where accountability applies to everyone regardless of who they are or where they come from.
I think that's a really important point to emphasize. This isn't just an abstract legal debate.
Yeah.
It has real-world consequences for real people.
You got it. And that's why it's crucial for everyone to be informed about these issues and to engage in these conversations in a thoughtful and constructive way.
Before we wrap up this discussion, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the potential for this bill to create a ripple effect and undermine the broader system of international law.
That's a concern that's been raised by many legal scholars and human rights advocates. They argue that if the U.S., a country that has traditionally played a leading role in shaping international norms, starts picking and choosing which international laws it will abide by, it could set a dangerous precedent for other countries to do the same.
So this bill could have implications that go far beyond the ICC. It could have a cascading effect, eroding the very foundations of international law and cooperation.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to think carefully about the long-term consequences of this legislation. We need to ask ourselves what kind of world we're creating for future generations. A world where might makes right, or a world where justice and accountability prevail.
I think that's a question that all of us need to grapple with. And it's a question that goes to the heart of our values and our vision for the future.
Well said. And it's a conversation that needs to happen not just in the halls of Congress, but in classrooms and communities and around dinner tables across the country. Because ultimately, it's up to all of us to shape the world we want to live in.
And that's a great segue to our final point, the importance of education and awareness. You're absolutely right. If we want to be engaged citizens and make informed decisions about these complex issues, we need to understand the facts, the arguments, and the potential consequences.
And that's where initiatives like Study Hall come in. You're providing a valuable service by breaking down these complicated topics and making them accessible to a wider audience. It's about empowering people with knowledge so they can participate in these critical conversations in a meaningful way.
We appreciate that. We believe everyone has the capacity to understand these issues, and it's our goal to provide the tools and insights to do so.
And I think it's important to emphasize that this isn't just about legal theory or international relations. These issues have real-world implications for people's lives. The ICC was created to provide justice for victims of the most serious crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. These are crimes that shatter lives, tear apart communities, and leave lasting scars on entire societies.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in the legal and political debates. But we need to remember the human cost of these crimes and the importance of holding perpetrators accountable.
Exactly. And that's why the stakes are so high in this debate over the ICC and H.R. 23. If the U.S. undermines the court's authority, it could send a message to perpetrators of these crimes that they can act with impunity. And that would be a tragedy for victims and a setback for the cause of justice around the world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave our listeners with? What are some of the most important things to keep in mind as we continue to grapple with these complex issues?
First, I think it's crucial to understand that this debate over the ICC is part of a broader conversation about the U.S. role in the world and its relationship to international law. The U.S. has historically been a leader in promoting human rights and the rule of law, but it has also shown a willingness to act unilaterally when it perceives its interests to be at stake. And that tension is at the heart of this current debate.
So it's a balancing act between national interest and global cooperation.
Exactly, and there are no easy answers. But I think it's important for all of us to engage in this debate in a thoughtful and informed way, to understand the arguments on both sides, and to consider the long-term consequences of our actions.
Second, I think it's crucial to remember that the ICC is not a perfect institution. It has been criticized for its focus on Africa, its bureaucracy, and its perceived inefficiencies. But it's important to acknowledge that the ICC is a relatively young institution and that it's still evolving. And despite its flaws, it remains an important mechanism for holding individuals accountable for the most serious crimes. So we need to be critical but also constructive in our engagement with the ICC.
Absolutely. We need to push for reforms where necessary, but also recognize the important role that the court plays in the international justice system.
And finally, I think it's important to remember that this debate is not just about legal theory or abstract principles. It's about real people, real victims, real communities. And we need to approach these issues with empathy, compassion, and a commitment to justice.
Well said. At the end of the day, this is about building a world where all people are treated with dignity and respect, and where perpetrators of the most serious crimes are held accountable for their actions.
And that's a world worth fighting for. So to our listeners, we encourage you to continue learning about these issues, to engage in these conversations, and to make your voices heard.
You have the power to shape the world you want to live in.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
Indeed it has. The ICC H.R. 23 and the broader questions of international law and U.S. foreign policy are all incredibly complex and multifaceted. But I think we've managed to shed some light on the key arguments, the potential consequences, and the underlying values at stake.
And that's really what Study Hall is all about, isn't it? Taking these complex issues, breaking them down into digestible pieces, and encouraging our listeners to think critically and engage in these important conversations.
Absolutely. Because knowledge is power. And when we are informed, we are empowered to make a difference in the world.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the International Criminal Court in H.R. 23. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, stay curious, keep learning, and never stop asking questions.
Until next time, this is Study Hall signing off.